there is no national interest whatsoever in farm price supports or in government attempts to manipulate the price of farm products any more than there is in government attempts to manipulate the price of steel or of any other product. But it's much more fundamental than that. Agriculture is one of our major export industries. It is an area in which we have been incredibly efficient, in which we can produce goods and outcompete almost everybody in the rest of the world. There is nothing that would be in the greater self-interest of the agricultural producer than for the U.S. to have complete free trade. That would generate a greater supply of dollars abroad to produce a better market for U.S. products. I submit to you that the movement toward having farm price supports is a very short-sighted movement. What will be its results? It can only have the effect of either destroying export markets or requiring the government once again to subsidize exports. If we have a high artificial price at home, which is above the world price, nobody in the world is going to buy American products unless somebody or other sells it to them at the world price. And hence, a system of artificially high domestic agricultural prices necessarily requires a system of government subsidies for the export of wheat abroad. I submit to you that that's not in the interest of the American consumer, it's not in the interest of the American taxpayer, and in the longer run it is not in the interest of the American farmer. Yes, sir.
Well, I have seen that the free trade ideal has remained mostly an ideal we are striving for. We have seen that in continental Europe, they are leaving it aside every time some of their economic advantages are involved. I'm very concerned with what happens to the farmer here in Kansas. I've been a long-time resident, and I've been thinking the following. Last year, we exported a lot of grain. It went to Europe, and I think 2/3 went to Russia, to the Soviets. Now, what happened in those countries, in the purchasing countries, they had to pay in their currency about 15% less than what they paid a year before. This was due to the dollar devaluation. By that situation, I figure that the Russians have received a bonus of maybe $1.5 billion, which inflation has paid for. In other words, the American taxpayer. So what would you think, Dr. Friedman, if somebody came up with an innovation, with an idea to establish an offset, an equalization for this bonus of the dollar devaluation to people that buy in Rotterdam, to people that buy in Russia?
I think it would be a very bad idea.
I would say, Dr. Friedman, it would require no bureaucracy whatsoever. It would be handled by the bank that receives the payment drafts, and then this money could genuinely be given to the farmer, out of whose hide it was taken in the first place.
It was not taken out of the hide of the farmer. I beg your pardon. A market is a market. You know, I did not hear any complaints from farmers at the time that farm prices were abnormally high. Did you? What is this? Are we going to have a game of heads I win, tails you lose? Agriculture is an industry like every other industry. The farmer is an entrepreneur and a businessman. He is in a business which has a characteristic feature of having a fluctuating income. Obviously, in going into that business, he takes into account the fact that some years his income will be high and some years his income will be low. I do not believe it is true, as you say, that anything has been taken out of the hide of the farmer. On the contrary, if we take the experience of the United States over the past 20 years, we have had enormous governmental subsidies to the farmer. Now, the farmer hasn't benefited from that. Let me go slowly. You see, the problem with all of these things like you're describing is that they never have the results that the well-intentioned people who propose them intend to have. What is the effect of spending a lot of money trying to help the farmer? The effect of it is, first of all, to encourage more people to be farmers than otherwise would. Second of all, to make costs of producing agricultural products higher than they otherwise would be, because the counterpart of this is that you take land out of cultivation. It has a lot of side effects which eat up a large fraction of the gain, but that doesn't reduce the cost to the taxpayer. The taxpayer has paid twice. He has paid in the form of higher prices for his food than he need have paid, and he has paid second in the form of the taxes. Now, so far as the Russian case is concerned, I believe you have to be very careful here. I think we should allow the Russians freely to buy all the agricultural products they want, provided they pay for it with their own money, out of their own pockets, and we don't subsidize them. The real problem with the Russian purchases is that in large part it has been subsidized by loans from Western countries. Insofar as those loans are made by private people, that's their business. They're risking their money. Insofar, however, as they have been government guaranteed, as they often have, I am opposed to that. I do not believe that we ought to guarantee loans to the Russians. But then I think we ought to say, okay, if the Russians want to buy wheat, fine. So far as the common market is concerned, they have engaged in agricultural protectionism on a large scale, as you say. They are making a mistake to doing that. They are already suffering by paying a higher price for their agricultural products than they need to. We ought to encourage them to reduce their barriers, of course, on trade. But I think, how many times have you and I heard the story that here is a particular government reform which will not require a bureaucracy? I'm sorry, sir, there is no such animal.
I stand corrected with pleasure.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Friedman, there are people in agriculture who feel that farm programs work to the disadvantage of the American farmer, but perhaps for a different reason than you cited in the formal portion of your lecture. What would you say to the argument that someone in agriculture may make, that farm price support programs for agriculture are a disadvantage to the farmer because an urban-oriented Congress has learned how to use farm subsidies to increase domestic farm production far and above what the free market itself would have dictated?
Well, there are... you're raising, as you realize, an extremely complex question, which does not admit of a one- or two-sentence answer. I realize, and I did not mean, and I do not mean, to suggest that all farmers or all farm organizations are in the same class. They're not. The Farm Bureau Federation has, over most of its existence, been a staunch supporter of free markets in agriculture. It has, in general, been opposed to the kind of restrictive measures and price supports and so on that have been followed. And I believe that the argument you make is a valid one. This is why I said earlier that although the taxpayer has paid heavy sums, it is not clear that the farmer has benefited. But also it's not clear that the consumer has benefited. Because what we have done in large part over past periods is to dispose of those extra artificially produced surpluses, not by selling them at home at low prices, but by giving them away abroad at low prices. So that it is not, in my opinion, the urban-oriented legislator who has been benefiting his constituents in this way. It's a very complicated question. There is no doubt that resistance to high farm price supports has been increased by the presence of more and more of a larger and larger urban population and a larger representation. See, I think what you're describing is a much more general proposition. Almost every government policy may have short-term benefits to small groups, but in the long run, it tends to help nobody but simply waste the money. And the reason for that, in general, is the kind of thing you're describing here. Because if government is going to give away $1 billion, it pays people to spend $1 billion to get it. Now, the people who get it aren't always the ones who spend the money. Some people are disappointed. They engage in a lottery. They spend money in the hope of getting a government measure which will benefit them, and they lose. Other people win the prizes. But on the average, the group as a whole is likely to lose. Why does it lose? Because in addition to the money that's taken from the taxpayers, a commission is taken off the top by the bureaucrats who collect it and the bureaucrats who distribute it. So you take $1 out of the right-hand pocket of people in order to put 75 cents back in the left-hand pocket. And that's the kind of thing you have in the case of agricultural subsidies, in my opinion.